Hey, welcome back. It's Gray, and I'm here to talk to you today about externally rotated hips. This came up when one of my other students talked to me about a hip deformity that he has, and it keeps him in a very externally rotated position. And he was asking me some questions about how he could help mitigate this and what he could do basically to stop the pain that occurs from him being in this externally rotated position all the time. For those of you that do not know, an externally rotated hip kind of just looks like this, where your feet are super duper turned out. Okay, so that being said, let's get into it. What are some problems that come with chronically externally rotated hips? Well, the first thing that we talk about is the cowboy walk. Okay, so you're kind of walking like you just got off a horse. All right, I know you can't see my legs super duper well, but you can imagine how a cowboy with spurs would walk. Okay, now this isn't necessarily bad to do in the short term, but in the long term this causes issues because tissues tend to adapt. Oop, let me get my annotations up here. Can I select? Yep, there we go. Tissues adapt to the stresses they're put under, okay? Okay, so what does this mean for our example here with somebody who's chronically externally rotated? Well, muscles like their tensor fascia latae or tensor fascia lata TFL, I never know how to pronounce that, tend to be shortened, all right? And their adductor group and their deep internal rotators tend to be very lengthened. We call this a length-tension relationship. Length tension. I'm not going to spell out relationship, okay? Just know. So with a length-tension relationship, what we mean is how tight one muscle is relative to another muscle's length. Another good example for this is you see this a lot in the shoulder joint where somebody can't really externally rotate that much because they have a bad length-tension relationship. And this manifests itself usually when we're trying to produce force with any of the muscles related to that joint. The hip being a ball and socket joint, like the shoulder, it is complex. So let me not get too off track here. Let's see. So when he's walking, right, he was complaining of some shin pain, okay? He'd been in like kneeling positions for rifle shooting for long periods of time. And when he gets up, there's a lot of shin pain. Also, when he has to do his running, there's a lot of shin pain. Well, it's because if you have these feet which are externally rotated and you're running, striking with your heels, okay, you're going to put a lot of stress right on the medial side of the tibia. Medial in this case meaning towards the midline of the body, right? So the inside of your shin right here. So you got my foot turned out and I'm striking the ground just like that. You can see how the line of force, all right, so this is me. The line of force will be going straight up into there, all right? And when your foot's turned out like that, you're just exposing the medial side of your tibia to that force a lot more. You can imagine if you had the opposite where your toes were turned in while you were walking, you would be putting a lot of pressure on the balls of your feet. And if you go and you walk kind of pigeon-toed like that, you will feel a substantial difference. You feel that a lot more in the lateral compartment of your lower leg. Lateral meaning towards the outside of the body, okay? So, what are some interventions, some really simple interventions you can do to address these issues? Well, number one, where I told him to start. Since he does have a sort of deformity in the formation of his hip, the actual bony structure, there's only so much we can do. We can still drill internal rotation, but we have to be very careful. I told him, I don't recommend you start off with something like a barbell squat, for example, because we don't want to reinforce bad patterns. If I tell him to squat and he's squatting super externally rotated, that's not necessarily a terrible thing as a concept, but for him, it's probably going to exacerbate his pre-existing injuries and pains, okay? So we have to get him to be able to perform knee flexion extension and use gait mechanics that don't favor external rotation if we want long-term joint health, okay? So I said, let's start off with a hip thrust variation. You can do a lying hip thrust where you're laying on your back and you're pushing your hips up in the air, okay? You can load this a little bit, but honestly, I would wait until you can kind of progress and use your glutes effectively in a, shoulders elevated glute bridge, okay? So what we're looking for in this glute bridge, if you're doing a glute bridge and you have your legs turned out like this, right, your femurs externally rotated, then what are we doing? That's not the point. You want to have your femurs as internally rotated as you're able, okay? At least to neutral, optimally. In this person's case, he's going to struggle to get to neutral, and that's the point. You want to be able to use your glutes from a neutral femur position or even slightly internally rotated, just so we can drive that. If you have more internal rotation that you can start from, when you do something like a squat, you have more external rotation you can move into, and the range of motion is going to feel a lot more comfortable. The other thing there is when we get past the glute bridge, okay, he's been progressing there. Is there anything else he can do in the meantime? Because he brought up some machines he likes to do, like the adductor machine. The hip adductor, where you're sitting in a chair and you got your legs and you're doing like this and you're squeezing your legs together to work the adductor groups, okay? Well, that's not necessarily bad, but you have to do it a specific way. When you set up on the adductor machine, this is a front view right here. Bear with my drawing, okay? Let's see, I'll use red. Okay, this is the pad of the machine. And then this is the other pad of the machine, okay? And I'm gonna erase this just so I have more space to draw, if I can. And then right here, this is me. I'm sat down. I have my arms right here, and then my legs are on the outside of the machine. These are my femurs, okay? And these are my feet. And my feet will rest on like these little bars that come out from here, and I am squeezing in this way, and I'm working my adductors on the inside of my thigh, right? So you can imagine that if this leg was pushed up against the pad, my knees pushing right up against this pad, if this leg is out if it's in like this, okay, so I've got my foot wedged up against this as far as I can. This is an externally rotated position. That's reinforcing bad habits. What he should do if he wants to address his hips is put his foot towards the outside of whatever thing he has to put his foot on. That way, the angle right here is different, right? We're driving internal rotation. The hip has rotated internally, okay? Do you see what I mean? That's actually a very good exercise to address this issue. So what sort of issues can you have other than what we've discussed with the reoccurring shin splints and whatnot with the cowboy walk? Well, you can be like me and have a higher propensity to tweak your adductor groups, especially on a machine like this. For a long time, I would train my adductors, even with stuff like split squats or hinges, like your RDLs. And what would wind up happening is I would have a good 9 weeks of training, and then like clockwork, I would tweak my adductor or hamstring, okay? And really by tweaking hamstring, I mean the adductor magnus, because the adductor magnus runs into your hamstring group. It actually has a hamstring head. So usually that's what you tweak on something like an RDL or a stiff-legged deadlift, right? You can't really tell the difference, at least by sensation, unless you're really, really keyed into this like I am. But I would also get twinges of pain in my sartorius, which is another muscle that runs on the leg. So like if, here we go, here's my thigh. Here is the adductor group. The sartorius kind of runs like in a little cute little S shape right there. This is terrible, but you get the idea. I usually draw legs way better than that. You'll get to see that another time. But yeah, so tweaking your sartorius, like that's what I would do on this machine, and I could feel it because it would run right up into the part of the hip where it ties into. So you have to be very careful on this machine. Another tip that I gave is don't push range of motion too quickly. So with this, let's say he's driving internal rotation like he's supposed to. His ability to open up the hips, right, to get that back and get a stretch and alter the length tension relationship there is going to be severely limited. He told me that when he even just tried it, just sitting on a table and trying to drive internal rotation, he gets a cramp in his TFL. That's because his TFL is not used to lengthening in that manner, right? So you have to push the stretch back gently, okay? So I would work up with a limited range of motion. This kind of ties into the last video we had with graded exposure and load management, but work up with a moderate range of motion, okay? Build some strength there. Then increase the range of motion, reset, pretend it's a new exercise, okay? And then work your way back up, okay? That's the basic principle for addressing almost any poor length tension relationship or restoring movement. Thank you for watching this one, and catch you later.